Unto the Hills by Margaret Walker Freel. Chapter 11. Margaret Scott was now 16 years of age, full of life and blooming into womanhood. In spite of the hardships experienced in the mountains and the hard work she had to do as the eldest in a family of 10 children, Margaret still managed to be high-spirited and happy. She and her friend Elizabeth Collett were visiting and giggling together when Mrs. Collett interrupted them with the suggestion that they might be interested in looking into their future. "Girls, here's an old superstition you might like to try. You can tell who your future husband is going to be with the use of this lamb's shoulder blade." The girls laughed in disbelief, but decided it would be fun to play the game anyway. "Now," said Mrs. Collett, as she handed each a piece of lamb's shoulder blade and a knife, "it's sort of like plucking the petals from a daisy and saying, 'He loves me not.' Only with this, you stick the knife in the bone and you say, 'It is not this bone I mean to stick, but my lover's heart I mean to prick.' Then you take the bone and hide it under your pillow and sleep on it for 3 nights. And soon you'll see a young man who will come to you to tie up a wound." The girls laughed gaily at this silly little game, but of course they followed the instructions to the letter. Margaret was in the garden when she saw Billy Walker coming hurriedly to the house. It was unheard of for Billy to leave work and come home during store hours. Looking closely, Margaret soon saw that he was holding his left hand and that it was bleeding freely. Margaret rushed toward him. "Billy, what happened? Have you hurt yourself?" Billy answered, somewhat disgusted with himself. "Oh, I was cutting leather for Billy Meadows to fix his shoes and my hand slipped. I'm afraid the cut is a little deep. Would you tie it up for me, please?" Margaret hastened to get the bandage and turpentine. "I know this hurts, Billy, and I'm so sorry." "Oh, it doesn't hurt much," said Billy, as he watched Margaret's intense face over the wounded hand. He forgot about his wound as he thought about the girl. This unusual closeness made him realize how he had really meant it when, back at the corn shucking in the fall, he had announced to the world, or at least to the valley settlers, that he did have a best girl, and Margaret Scott was she. By ones, by twos, by threes, on foot, on horseback, in wagons and carriages they came, the merrymakers young and old, to the big house of Abram Collett. The Collett house was the oldest and most pretentious in the settlement. Its columns, double porches, and its crepe myrtles and enormous oak trees were restful and typically Southern. At the side of the house were long barbecue pits banked with hot coals, and the aroma of sizzling, dripping meat tantalized the appetites of the visitors. The Collett slaves had been busy since daybreak, getting ready for this pre-nuptial party for Margaret Scott and William Walker. When the happy couple arrived along with Margaret's family, they were greeted by friends from the entire county. There was Tarplay Young and his family from Red Marble Gap. His younger brother Alfred was hanging around making eyes at 14-year-old Maria Scott. No celebration would be complete without the presence of Dr. Patton and his family from Murphy. Henry Weatherman came with his family from way up Junaluska near Weatherman's Bald. John Piles, one of the very earliest settlers, came with his family. Gilpin Phillips from Gipps Creek was there. Grandsire Whitaker, his wife, and a goodly number of his 16 children were in attendance. Old Thomas Tatham, his wife, and their 2 sons and their families were there with young John, strutting somewhat in self-importance over the fact that he was in the process of building the first brick house in the county. There were the Hennesseys and the Brittons. Of course, George Hayes from Murphy was there with his pretty second wife, who was a sister to Mrs. Collett. From Morris Creek came Gideon Morris and his wife Rebecca, the daughter of Yonaguska, the Indian chief. The Reverend James Kimsey, the Baptist preacher, was among the guests. Mercer Fane came with Mrs. Fane, rustling in silk, which was much envied by many of the female guests, who were dressed in their best homespun. Stephen and Elizabeth Whitaker and young Thomas and Polly Tatham and their 6 mischievous boys, who were neighbors of the Scotts, were present. Also from Murphy came the Maronis and the Axleys. Following the feast, pictures were taken. Photography back in the early days was a long, painstaking process. Once this was completed, the group scattered to rest and to reassemble on the morrow for the wedding ceremony. It was autumn in the mountains of western North Carolina, a time and place that was destined to become a Mecca for all seekers after beauty, and a place to return to the natural wonders of the world in years to come. The day of the wedding was a golden day, filled with sunshine and autumn hues and a bright riot of color up and down the creek. The 15th of October, 1844, was Margaret Scott's wedding day. Was there ever such a day? John Scott's eldest and favorite daughter was getting married. This was the first of his large family to leave home. Months and months of preparation had been put in by the entire family in getting ready for this important day in Margaret's life. Wogg's sawmill was in operation, and John, with Abram's help, had added more rooms to the house. Now they had a parlor. John was pleased with his daughter's forthcoming marriage. He liked his future son-in-law. John had delved into the treasured store of gold to provide the things that he wanted for his beloved child. Mary Trinkle Scott was 39 years old, and according to the standards of the day, she was an old woman. She was the mother of 10 children. 20 years had passed since, coming from the sheltered life of a convent, she had been charmed and carried away from her family by the young Scotchman, John Scott. Through the many hours, as she used her skill with the needle to fashion the lovely dresses for her daughters to wear at the wedding, she daydreamed and reminisced over her life. Mary hurriedly dressed for the wedding. She glanced at her reflection in the mirror, and though time had taken its toll, she was not displeased with what she saw. In the dimming light, there was still something beautiful about her. Her once raven hair, though now graying, was still luxuriant. Her long, straight nose was softened by the lovely, dark eyes. The work-worn hands were covered by silk mittens. The black taffeta dress, with its tight-fitting basque and hooped skirt, did not conceal the quiet grace of her body. Mary turned her attention to her daughter Margaret, who, from exhaustion and excitement, had fallen asleep on the foot of Mary's bed. Mary studied her daughter for a few moments, then she awakened her. Margaret, though not ordinarily pretty, was radiant as she slipped into the blue silken gown which her mother had so lovingly made. Madonna blue was her favorite color, and it matched the blueness of her eyes. "Oh, Mother, I'm so happy. This dress is lovely. It's the most beautiful dress you've ever made. Oh, Mother, I love you." Standing there watching Margaret glowing in her happiness, Mary was suddenly overcome with the reality that this, her special favorite daughter, the child who had been her strength through many hard times, was getting married and leaving home. Along with the reality came a phantom of evil foreboding. In spite of herself, Mary started crying. "Why, Mother?" asked Margaret as she saw her mother's tears. "You are crying. Please don't be sad. I am so happy." Mary's arms went around her firstborn child as she clutched her for a fleeting instant. With the determined strength of willpower, Mary soon regained control of herself and smiled bravely through her tears. "Please stay happy for always and always," she whispered, almost as though it were a prayer. The girls in the family were not alone in their feeling of loss at Margaret and Billy's leaving to start a home of their own. Young Abram, who had shared his loft room with Billy over these past few years, realized that after today he would have this room alone. As he watched his future brother-in-law make final preparations for his wedding, Abram was both proud and sad. Mary watched, her lips moving in silent prayer, as Margaret and Billy stood before the Reverend Kimsey and repeated the vows that made them man and wife. Grandsire Whitaker, with his arms raised heavenward, pronounced the final benediction on the pair. There was silence as Billy took Margaret in his arms and shyly kissed her before the assembled audience. This broke the spell. There were boisterous congratulations. Everybody kissed the bride and then hurried to the feasting table. It was groaning under the burden of the food. Everything good to eat was there, from baked hams dripping with molasses and cloves, to wild turkey filled with sage and chestnut dressing, to pumpkin pies. Almost before everyone had his fill, Hamilton Collett produced his banjo, and Alfred Young his fiddle, and the strains of Sourwood Mountain poured forth. There was laughter, music, and dancing until late in the evening. The big front bedroom of the Scott home had been reserved for the bride and groom. Mary slipped Margaret through the door alone, while Billy waited discreetly outside. Margaret stood in the middle of the floor for a fleeting instant. Then the enchanting dream world collapsed, and stark reality came. Mary had told her that she must be Billy Walker's wife when they were married, but in her innocence the staunch little Margaret quailed. It had seemed natural for Pa and Mother to occupy the same room, but the realization that Billy might come in while she was undressing made her tremble. Realization brought action. The Madonna blue dress was literally torn from her body in frantic haste. Next, the many petticoats and the chemist with a jerk came off. The little white homespun gown with Mary's hand-knitted lace high around the neck was feverishly pulled over her head. She snatched the beautiful hand-tufted spread back and, trembling like a cornered hare, she crept beneath the protective folds of the hand-woven sheets. Her heart was pounding when she heard the slight knock at the door. She didn't answer. Finally, the door parted slightly, and Billy's voice whispered, "Margaret?" Still, her tongue clove to the roof of her mouth, and she could not answer. At last, Billy came in. She heard a few quiet movements. Steps came hesitantly across the room, then stopped, and there was silence. She lifted the cover slightly and peered out. In the dim light, she saw Billy standing uncertainly in his homespun nightshirt. Realization came over her. He was as frightened as she. Courage and peace and a feeling of rightness stole over her. The hand that had been clutching the cover relaxed its grip, and she extended her arm to her new husband as she whispered Billy. At last, Billy moved, and there was an answering whisper, "Margaret." Touch love with prayer, it is a holy thing. No dove with snowier wing fanned Eden's air. To mortal care, heaven's whitest angel truth, entrust it, O youth, touch love with prayer. Chapter 12. Margaret turned and lifted her hand in farewell as she sat beside Billy in the little one-horse wagon. She was leaving the home she had known to start a new one of her own. Her own home, what a wonderful thought! And yet there was sadness in this leave-taking. Though her new home was only around the bend in the road, it was a completely new and strange world for Margaret. She looked at her father, a tired, gray-haired old man, as he stood on his doorstep with his silent family around him. Standing beside him was Mary, her mother, not crying, but already missing the constant companionship of her eldest daughter. A little apart were the girls, quiet and wistful in the early morning light. Laura, the youngest, was not there. She had fled and taken refuge in the mill house. Though only a child of 3, she understood that Margaret was going away and that she would miss her. Young Abram stood somewhat apart. His face was grave and his bare toes dug nervously into the ground. He would miss his sister, but most of all, he would miss this stern, silent man who had shared his loft with him. He was in awe of Billy, almost feared him, yet he secretly worshipped him. Suddenly, John Scott shook himself. His great voice rang out in the morning stillness as he called, "Wait, Margaret, I have something for you." He turned and entered the house, and in a moment returned with something in his arms. It was his most beloved keepsake. It was the sword which he had used in the War of 1812. "Here, I want you to have my sword. You are the oldest, and you're the one who should have it." "Oh, Pa, you keep it." Margaret was pleased but doubtful. "Besides, Abram is the one who should have it. He's an only son." "No, Margaret. I want you to have it now, while I am living. Some day you can pass it on to your son." Margaret held the treasure on her lap and smiled at her father. "Pa, thank you. I shall treasure it always. I hope some day I will have a son, and I will give it to him." Margaret and Billy were preparing to move away when at the last moment little Laura appeared and burst into a loud and mournful wail. "Ah, shut up, Laura," said Abe. "Nobody's dead." Margaret blew Laura a kiss as Billy clucked to the pony, and the wagon lurched forward, bouncing over rocks. A lump that could not be swallowed stuck in her throat. Margaret's eyes misted as they rounded the bend, and she could no longer see the home of her youth. There was a conglomeration of articles and animals on the wagon. In addition to Margaret's and Billy's meager wardrobes, which took up very little space, there were the bare necessities for cooking dried fruits and vegetables, and household articles, which included a feather bed and some homemade quilts. At Margaret's feet were 4 noisy chickens floundering about with their legs securely tied. Bringing up the rear was a lank red Durham cow, nervously watching her young, clumsy offspring as it lay in the back of the wagon. Margaret already loved the little red cow and her wobbly calf. She had named the cows Mary and Martha. As the little pony and wagon jounced along, Margaret's new bonnet seemed to stifle her, so she slipped it back and tied the strings under her chin. The bonnet floated behind in the breeze. Her fair golden hair floated in the morning air. The new homespun dress, dyed with indigo, fitted her shapely young body and matched her bright, happy blue eyes. She looked shyly around while glad, carefree thoughts and plans raced through her mind. A late cardinal caught her eye, and a happy little trill came from his throat, as if he were aware of Margaret's happiness. A squirrel barked and scampered out of the way of the approaching wagon wheels. A covey of partridges flew up in the noisy confusion. Toonie, Margaret's cat, lay purring in her lap as she stroked and fondled it. Margaret had always loved cats, and Toonie was one of her dearest possessions. They were now crossing Junaluska Creek. The pony halted and drank greedily from the cool, crystal-clear water. Margaret moved closer to Billy so as not to allow water to splash her new dress. In doing this, her body pressed against Billy's, and she glanced shyly up towards his silent, clean-shaven profile, which was so rare among men of that day. His fair skin, too, was in contrast to all the other men who worked out of doors and were leather-browned by the sun. Billy's work inside the store had kept him clean and handsome. His strong hands were pale and soft. He pulled at the reins and clucked to the horse, for they must be moving along so that Billy could be in the store on time. Not even on his wedding day did Billy take an instant of time from the store, lest Colonel Wogg be angered. Neither weddings, births, nor deaths could soften the stern Scotchman. As Margaret sat in the wagon contemplating Billy, she noted the stern set of his strong, manly shoulders. She was a little frightened by this man beside her, who was now her husband. She was married now. This big man beside her, who was 14 years her senior, was her husband. The preacher had said last night, "Take this woman, Margaret Jane Scott, to be thy wedded wife." Later last night, when they had whispered shyly in the darkness of their room, he had said, "Margaret, my little girl." Now they were going home, and she was Billy's wife. She belonged to him. She must cook for him, wash his clothes, and sleep beside him in the pretty cherry bed. She was no longer a girl. She was a woman with a home of her own. She would continue to do many of the things she had done since she was a little girl. She would clean and make beds and sew and cook, but now it would be different. She would plant her own garden. She would watch the birds from her own window. Suddenly they rounded the sharp curve that brought them to their destination. Here was the little house with the 2 big rooms. The little cottage made of huge hewn logs nestled among enormous hemlock trees. This was their home, tightly chinked with clay to keep it snug through bitter winter days. Here was their house with its puncheon floor and its enormous fireplace. Margaret looked at her new home and breathed a prayer. Dear God, give courage for building the house of life. To the east must be forbearance each day. Give to the west faith, ever a glorious way. The north wall must be hope against winds of fate. Abiding love shall brace the south to overcome hate. Beneath the feet grant deepest humility, for shelter above the firmament infinity. Dear God, grant wisdom to build the home of life. The little pony stopped as Billy drew on the reins. For the first time since they had started this journey, Billy turned and looked at Margaret. He smiled and said simply, "Little girl, do you like your new home?" Margaret's starry eyes gave a far more eloquent answer than her trembling lips could form. Billy's voice was eager as he said, "I've a surprise for you. I bought this little house from Colonel Wogg. It's ours, our very own." His usual stern countenance was covered with a rare smile as he turned to lift Margaret from the wagon. "Little girl, are you scared?" he asked. Margaret's face was flushed as she answered, "No, Billy, I'm not afraid. I love you." Tooney jumped from the wagon and walked sedately into his new home unnoticed by his owners as Billy held out his arms to Margaret, and together they entered their new home. Billy held Margaret close as he whispered, "My little girl, my wife, I love you." His lips caught hers. However, a workaday world could not be ignored for long. Billy had to unload the wagon and get to the store by 7 o'clock. Margaret was left to open the bundles and decide where to put things. She released the chickens from their rope and gave them a handful of corn to make them feel at home. They scurried suspiciously around, feeling strangely away from the big flock. The cow, seeing her calf, lowed lonesomely. Even the answering note from her offspring did not seem enough. Margaret crossed the road and drove the cow away from the bars to where there were plenty of grass for grazing. On the way back to the house, Margaret glanced at the bare yard. Aloud she said, "This yard looks bad, but it'll have to wait. There is so much to do inside." Margaret gave the yard one backward glance as she hurried into the house, mentally making a list of the things she had to accomplish before Billy came in for his dinner. She went to the fireplace and stirred up the fire. She reminded herself of the things that she had been taught about being a frugal housewife. Pa always said a man never had anything if his wife threw it out the back door. And Mother said it was sinful to be wasteful, and that if you watched the little leaks, there would never be any big ones. Billy wanted land, and because he did, she did. Oh, she would be careful about everything. She would be saving, and someday they would have lots of land. As Margaret hurried from task to task, a song came into her throat. It was not a staid hymn such as her mother sang. It was a silly, happy jig that young Alfred Young played on his fiddle when the young people danced. Even though Margaret was a married woman, cooking her man's dinner, she was only 18, and her lithe young body swayed as she hurried to and fro while she hummed Sourwood Mountain. She carried in more wood to replenish the fire. Then she set her iron pot on the crane and the big iron oven in the coals. She sliced meat and fried it in the oven. This would be meat for their dinner. It would also grease the oven so the bread would not stick. In addition, it would be shortening for the cornbread. She mixed the meal, salt, the shortening, and buttermilk, patted it into a round hoe cake, and placed it in the oven. She covered it with the lid and placed the coals on top. Still singing, she peeled Ben Davis's apples, sweetened them with honey, covered them with water, and put them on the crane. She washed 2 chunky gal potatoes, placed them in the ashes, and then drew hot coals over the ashes. While dinner was cooking, she arranged the table. Margaret was an artist. I want my table to look pretty when Billy comes in. She placed her red and white checkered homespun cloth on the table. I'll make it especially pretty, she thought, and went outside to pick some wild asters for a centerpiece. She poured buttermilk into a pewter mug and placed 2 pewter plates on the table. She had no serving dishes, so the food was ladled from the cooking vessels onto the plates. Billy entered a little breathless from his fast walk from the store. He kissed his bride and asked, "How are things with my little girl? Looks like you have everything under control. Looks pretty, too. Depend on you to have things looking pretty. Smells good. I've eaten your cooking at your paws, and I know you're a good cook, but this is different. It tastes better in our own home." They both felt a little shy as they sat down to eat. It was just a little strange eating alone for the first time. However, Billy was not too shy to do justice to the good food. He ate heartily. Margaret was tired and hungry. Her feet had taken many steps in the first half day in her new home. She ate hungrily also. The meal finished, Billy announced that Margaret's meal was better than her mother could have cooked. He offered to help her with some of her heavy tasks, but she refused his help by saying, "You must go back to work. I'm young and strong, and I'm used to all sorts of work. I'll manage things here at the house, and you manage the store. As Pa says, you keep the wolf away from the door, and I'll do the woman's work." "All right, little girl. I'm off to fight the wolf. But don't try to do everything today. There's always tomorrow, you know." He kissed her soundly and was gone. Margaret was still singing as she washed her plates. She was tired and her feet hurt from the rough floor, but she was happy and in love. She had cooked her first meal for her husband, and he had said it was good. Since Margaret had grown up in a home noisy with the chatter of many younger children, she found the silence of her own home difficult to take, so she remedied this by making her own chatter. When she wasn't singing, she was listing her plans out loud, or daydreaming, or talking to the cat out loud, and filling the house with happy sounds. The table cleared and the plates washed and stored on the shelf, Margaret started towards her next task. She must get the little bed ready for the night. This room was large and held the only fireplace in the house, and since winter was coming on, it was decided that they would live in here for a while at least. Billy had promised to add to the house. There will be many rooms with a fireplace in every room. Margaret had listened, but had reminded herself that big houses don't make people happy. It's what they do, not where they live. Billy had set the corded bed in the far corner, away from the fireplace. Margaret examined it. Abe and Billy had done a good job of stringing the ropes tight. "I'll put on this nice straw tick first," she said as she placed it on the bed. "I'm glad we could get some wheat straw. Mother says wheat straw is softer than rye straw. Some people use corn shucks, but they rattle and pack down. Now, here goes my feather bed." And so she continued as she completed the finishing touches by adding her prettiest patchwork quilt. It was red and green, and in the turkey tracks pattern. "That'll brighten up the whole room," she commented as she patted it smooth. Her glance landed on the loom that Billy had had Alfred Young make for her. It stood in the other corner of the room. This winter she would card, spin, and weave more woolen blankets. Also during the long winter she would piece and quilt some more covers. Maybe she would even have a quilting party. Margaret smiled as she counted her blessings aloud. At last the house was set in order. Martha was milked and Toonie was given her pan of warm milk. Billy came home at dark, and there was the second meal in their new home. The first long, busy, happy day was coming to a close. As darkness fell, Billy piled the huge fireplace high with logs. The firelight filled the room with its warm glow. Margaret had made candles, but one didn't use candles when there was plenty of firelight. As soon as supper was over, Margaret started preparations for bed. Billy would have to be at the store by 7 in the morning. As she was engrossed in the process of washing her bare feet, Billy came in and placed a very large bundle in her lap, saying simply, "For my wife." Margaret hastily opened the bundle. It was filled with useful household articles which Billy had fashioned out of wood with his carving knife during the hours when trade was dull at the store. "How wonderful!" cried Margaret as she examined each article. "You made all these things yourself? Gracious, here are 2 large wooden bowls. Here's a wooden spoon, a fork, a rolling pin, and even a new pair of wooden knitting needles. Goodness, that isn't all." "No, that isn't all. The last time I went to Charleston I got the rest of these things I knew that you would need. Oh, Billy, you brought me some precious thread, needles, and a thimble. Now I can sew and make everything we need." Her eyes shone with happiness as she rushed towards Billy and threw her arms around him. "You are the most wonderful man on earth. I have everything a woman needs. Thank you, Billy, and I love you." Billy's arms closed around her. "Margaret, you're the finest little girl, and I love you more than life. I can't do enough for you. I can't do all I want to do, but someday I'll do lots for you. I pray to God my wife will never need for anything as long as I live." And how Margaret was to remember that simple prayer. She placed the precious articles on the table and turned to get ready for bed. She took the long-sleeved gown from the chest, moved to the shadows, and somehow felt just a little easier tonight in removing her dress and putting the gown on. While Margaret was preparing for bed, William left the house and walked towards the cow pen. There was a tiny new moon. It was lying on its side, which meant it would soon rain. He leaned on the rough rails, and his little pony came up and nuzzled her wet nose on her sleeve. He absent-mindedly stroked the pony's nose as he stood there thinking, planning, and dreaming. William was 14 years older than Margaret, and naturally was more serious and settled. Also, he had never had a serious nature. He looked towards the house and saw a faint glimmer of firelight through the window. In the half-light of the new moon, he could see the dark trees up Junaluska. "Someday this will all be mine," he murmured. "This house, this orchard, the mill, the acres and acres of land. It will be mine and Margaret's and our children's. Margaret will have a big house, and my children will have money and land." William turned again to look at the little new moon. There it was, over his left shoulder, through a space clear and unmarred by trees or clouds. William smiled. "Mr. Scott would say that's a good omen to see the moon in the clear. I sure hope he's right. I hope good luck will come my way." He turned and walked back to the little log house with the pale, inviting glimmer of light showing through the window. William returned to the house where Margaret was waiting in bed beneath the turkey track quilt. "I saw the new moon in the clear tonight. Your pa would say that'll bring us good luck." "That does mean good luck," Margaret agreed. "I've never known it to fail. Maybe it means we will be happy and have lots of good, nice things happen to us. I'm so happy. I hope we will always be that way." William carefully covered the glowing fire and the room became dark. Somewhere out in the night came a strange, muffled sound. Billy raised his head from his pillow. "Margaret, did you hear something?" "I'm not sure, Billy. I thought I heard something, but it could be the cat or some stray dog." Once again, strange sounds could be heard, this time nearer, but immediately followed by silence. Terrified, Margaret clutched Billy. What in heaven's name? Then, tones of various musical instruments, cowbells and tin pans and discordant jangling notes rent the night stillness. "It's those foolish young folk wanting to have some fun," said Billy somewhat sheepishly. "I was afraid of this, but I'd forgotten about it. We must get into our clothes at once. We are expected to treat them. Let's hurry before they come in on us." Whereupon the young couple hastily snatched raiment onto their bodies. In a few moments, fully clad, the bride and groom appeared at the door ready to join the merrymakers. "Here," chorused the Tatham boys. "Billy, the groom always has to ride the rail. Come on now, like a sport, and let the boys have some fun." "Oh, well," said Billy, "I'm ready. Just don't be rough with the bride." The revelers proceeded to ride the groom around the house by torchlight, to the accompaniment of much joshing and the din of tin pans and cowbells. Then Billy yelled above the din, saying, "Come inside, folks, and let's have something to eat." While the young people were eating, Alfred Young stepped to the front, and soon the strains of Sourwood Mountain floated out. "Toast to the bride, folks. Grab your partner." The house shook while the young people ended the party with a square dance. When even the youngest was too tired to dance anymore, Hamilton Collett became the spokesperson for the group. "We all wish happiness for the bride and groom, but knowing that folks can't live on love alone, we have brought along a few things to help out." With this, all sorts of simple but useful things were showered upon the happy couple. Finally, at what would be considered a scandalously late hour for people who had to arise at dawn to attend farm chores, the serenaders made their way home. Then all was still and quiet in the little house. The happy couple was asleep. The fire crackled and sputtered its last, and lay in red embers, awaiting the new day.